We've got your overlays, we've got your audio devices figured out and your mixer configured. Next up, we are going to cover the scary, nerdy details that actually don't need to be that scary. Your resolution, your frame rate, and your encoder settings. I'm gonna make this all as easy as possible with recommendations as I go, and I'm gonna help you figure out what bit rates you should be using, and we're gonna get your stream ready to go live. And after this video, if you weren't already, you would be 100% ready to start streaming with the best possible settings. But there's still a ton more we're going to dive into. This is the latest episode of my Streamlabs desktop tutorial course, sponsored by Streamlabs. I'm EposVox, the Stream Professor. Let's flip over to the desktop and get to work. This episode is all about your stream and encoder settings, the settings that determine what your stream looks and feels like visually. We're going to talk about a lot of nerdy details, but I'm going to try to make them as easy to understand as possible so you can get up and running and get the best quality quickly. Now, by default, Streamlabs makes it easy to get the best quality out of the box, because if you go to settings and output, by default, it's set to simple. So all you have to worry about is a bitrate, basically, and your specific encoder. But there is some nerdiness that we can get into that will make things a little bit easier for you. First, let's talk about some of the decisions you're going to have to make when determining what settings you use for your stream. The first one is called the resolution. That is the dimensions, the size of the frame that is streamed to your viewer. Typically, this is done in some sort of HD format, either 720p, which is a resolution of 1280 by 720, or 1080p, which is a resolution of 1920 by 1080. If you're streaming to Twitch or Kick or Provo or whatever, those are the resolutions you should use. If you're streaming to YouTube, however, you may want to stream in a higher resolution to get higher quality on YouTube, such as 1440p, which is 2560 by 1440, or 4K, which is 3840 by 2160. We're going to mostly focus on the kind of default position of assuming that you're doing some sort of Twitch-ish streaming here. And so the easy default for that is to take a look at what screen resolution you have on your computer. We're going to assume a default of a Twitch-esque platform here. So we're going to assume that the cap for right now is about 1080p HD. Now, you may want to lower that if you cannot stream a high enough bit rate, which is another decision we're going to have to make in a minute that we'll get to in a moment. You may want to actually lower that resolution so you can get better quality for it. The reason for that is that your set frame size does not determine your quality. The bit rate determines your quality. The bit rate is the amount of bits, which is just data, per second that your stream gets. Twitch officially supports a cap of 6 megabits per second, but unofficially everyone's been doing close to 8 megabits per second or 8,000 kilobits per second total for their audio and video, which helps get you a little bit more quality. But that means that you have the set physical amount of bits, you have the set limited finite amount of bits that your stream can have, and the more that you make your frame bigger, the more those bits have to be stretched to a bigger frame, which is why you may want to keep a lower size frame for a lower bitrate. So we're going to go through the basic settings here. Streamlabs makes it super easy because by default, it's set to simple output mode. So when we get to the encoder stuff, you don't have to mess with a lot. But before we mess with the encoder, you actually need to go to your video settings. So if you didn't see that, bottom left, you may have this panel hidden. Go to settings and then video. Here is where you set your resolutions. You actually have two resolutions you can tweak. One is your base canvas resolution. This is just like an art canvas, a piece of paper, whatever. This is your actual set picture size that everything runs at. If you're streaming to Twitch, like I said, those kinds of platforms, you probably want this set to 1920 by 1080. Since that's what your final output would be, things will, especially the layouts and things like that, will run a lot easier if that is what you have it set to. However, if you plan on streaming, like I said, to YouTube, you may want to kick this up to 4K resolution, at which point you would come down here to custom and type in 3840 by 2160. Now, your second resolution, the output scale resolution, this gives you the option of scaling down your final frame to a lower resolution to be encoded. You might want to do this if you have specific sources that you want to maintain in a specific resolution, like your 4K monitor or something like that, but you still want to stream and make videos in HD. Broadly speaking, most people should just be doing 1920 by 1080 here and then matching that here. You may end up, if you don't have enough bitrate, setting this to 1280 by 720 to scale down to 720p to get better quality on Twitch. That is something you might have to do. By default, let's just go with 1080p. There's another option here that you will need to choose. By default, this filter called downscale filter is set to bilinear. This is super fast, which means it doesn't use a whole lot of resources, but looks really bad by comparison to bicubic, which to me is the best option you can go with that provides a nicer scale, assuming these numbers are different. If these numbers are the same, this doesn't matter at all. But if you are scaling down to, say, 720p or 864p or whatever gimmicky number people are trying to tell you on TikTok to use here, then you want to use bicubic here. The Linxos filter actually adds a fair bit of sharpening artifacts and doesn't look super great, in my opinion. Bicubic is the smoothest one to go. The other number we need to talk about is your frame rate, your frames per second, the amount of frames that your video will update per second. For just chatting, talking head streams, coding streams, art streams, those kinds of things, 30 FPS, totally fine. Shouldn't really push for anything beyond that. But if you're doing fast-paced action game streams, people will tend to prefer 60 frames per second these days, especially if you're coming from any console that's not the Nintendo Switch. And so you just type in 60 here instead of 30. But if you're just doing a just chatting or talking stream or something, 30 frames per second is what you want to go with. So we're going to assume a full gaming stream, 60 FPS, 1080p, flat here. That is your canvas done. You are now producing a 1080p 60 FPS canvas inside of Streamlabs. But next we have to determine your quality, and that is affected by a variety of factors. The primary one is that bitrate that I said before. Again, that is the amount of data per second that you can assign to your stream. Now, if we go to settings and output, we can start to mess with that. You have this whole section here that determines what we're doing with that. Your bitrate needs to be limited based on your internet speed. So we're going to open up a browser and open up any number of speed test websites and click go. Mine's going to be a little bit different because I'm uploading a video at the same time as I'm making this one. But we're just going to run a speed test to get a general idea of what our upload speed is. Now I have gigabit fiber, so other than my video uploading right now, these numbers should be fairly high. Not as high as I was expecting, but totally fine. That is download speed. Typically, whenever you're looking at downloads, whatever you're downloading, that is the number you look at. That's not relevant here. What matters is your upload speed. And you might be on a connection that has a pretty good download speed, but your upload speed is not very high. That will limit you as to what you can stream. You can see here, I have about 500 megabits per second up with my gigabit fiber connection, so not a big deal. I can upload anything I want to. Assuming you don't have gigabit fiber, which most people do not, then you need to set a rule that your streaming speed here should not exceed about 80% of your total upload capacity. So let's say you ran the speed test and your upload speed came out to about 7 megabits per second. Well, then you take 7,000 times 0.8, and that is the highest bit rate you can most likely stream reliably. You will potentially have to tweak this over time based on the reliability of, like I said, your connection. If you're on Wi-Fi, you're going to probably need to reduce this more. Wi-Fi is really unreliable for live streaming. But you don't want to exceed 80% of your total upload capacity. And this is because your internet speed is not static. It fluctuates over time. And there are many things that can happen in the background on your internet connection, from updates to uploading additional metadata, your phone syncing a photo from your iCloud or something. There's a lot of stuff that can happen on your network, and you don't want that to totally mess up your stream. So in this example, if we have a 7 megabits per second upload speed, we can type in 5600 here for our bitrate. Our bitrate is in kilobits per second. The speed test ran in megabits per second. Megabits are just 1000 kilobits. So 5600. That is the highest bandwidth that we can stream our video format to. Now, this is a low enough bitrate. I'd say once you start going under that 6 megabits per second limit, I'd recommend coming back over here to video and scaling that down to 720p. You're going to get the best results. That analogy I gave earlier, if we're taking this set number of bits and stretching it out to a bigger size, it's going to look worse than if we keep it in a smaller size. But you can do some test recordings, some test streams, determine for yourself. I'd say once you hit around 5 megabits per second, 1080p starts to look pretty chunky. The difference between, I'll put some examples on screen. The difference between 1080 and 720, assuming you have it set based on your bitrate, it's going to look mostly the same. The 720p stream will start to look a little softer, But if you don't have enough bits for 1080p, then it's going to start to look blocky and pixely. And I get a lot of comments from you all being like, why does my stream look such garbage? It's blurry or pixelated. It's because you don't have enough bits for the resolution you're streaming and you need to lower it. In extreme scenarios, where say you only can stream like 1500 kilobits per second or something, 720p is going to be off limits at that point. You need to scale even lower to 480p. Now, a lot of people are going to ask some questions in your chat, like, why aren't you streaming HD? But it is much better to have a slightly softer image that isn't full of blocks than a bigger image that is blocky and crunchy like crazy. Audio bitrate you do not need to acknowledge at all. 160 is fine. It is the standard for live streaming, and with the audio encoders that are used, it's not going to be a problem whatsoever. The final decision we have to make when optimizing our live stream here is the encoder. This is the software that is run to compress your live stream for Twitch or YouTube or whatever and produce the final result. You have some different options. Everyone's going to have this first one, Software X264. This is a standard traditional software encoder that just runs on your processor that everyone has access to. But depending on your graphics card, you're also going to have a hardware option, which is the NVIDIA, for me, the NVIDIA NVENC H264. If you have an NVIDIA card, you're going to see this one. If you have an AMD card, you're going to see the AMD AMF blah, blah, blah H264. For Intel, you're going to see Intel QuickSync H264. These are all great options and will save you a ton of performance. Running Software X264 encoding is pretty intense on your computer, and if you're doing other things like video editing, 3D rendering, gaming, those kinds of things, the Software X264 encoder is going to cause more of a performance impact on your system than the hardware option. The hardware option, if you have NVIDIA or Intel, is also going to look just as good, if not better, than what the software option here will produce. However, if you're on AMD, unless you're on the brand new generation that just came out, it struggles to compete a little bit in terms of H264 quality compared to the other options. And especially if you're at a lower bitrate, you may want to experiment with just trying software encoding instead. That is up to you, however. This is all in the simple mode. You can come up here under output mode and go to advanced. This is what I showed in the last video for setting up multiple audio tracks and things like that. This is mostly going to be the same thing. You can choose your encoder here. So hardware H264, always recommended. We determined for a 7 megabit upload speed, we can do 5,600 kilobits per second. But then you do have some more options for quality tuning. Honestly, these days, by default, the settings that it loads here are great. I would not really recommend messing with them much more than this. If you are on a dedicated stream PC, meaning whatever you are, the content that you are streaming is not generated by the computer you're streaming from. Either you have a separate PC you game on that you don't stream on, that it is fed to this computer, or you game on a console, or you're streaming physical art or whatever that you point a camera at, then you can change this preset. On NVIDIA, it's called P1 through P7, so you can go down to P7 slowest. I honestly recommend stopping at P6. So you can come down here, reduce the preset to P6, which is going to make it a very tiny, little bit better quality. On AMD and Intel, it will just say like quality, balanced, or speed. You can change that to quality, and you will get a little bit better quality, but ultimately, not much here is necessary. If you're doing really fast gaming content, you can turn on look ahead, which will improve things a little bit. And then really, everything I already said applies. And with this, you're going to have a great looking and sounding stream with minimal hassle. There's a lot of nerdy details here. I'd recommend rewinding, watching the parts of the video as you go through it a couple times. The big thing is to run that internet speed test, determining what bandwidth your internet connection can support, and then base your resolution on that. And otherwise, you don't really got to juggle much these days. Used to with streaming, especially in some other programs, like it was this really complex game of figuring out settings and encoder options and whatever. And these days, with how much more streamlined everything has gotten and how easy it is here in Streamlabs, you don't got to juggle a whole lot. It's pretty straightforward. Full tutorial course playlists will be in the description below so you can get caught up if you missed an episode or continue your education journey as we get through this series. Remember to be kind, rewind.